Good morning, kids. This week we are in chapter 22, which covers several revolutions that took place throughout the world, relatively at the same time. So we're going to be looking at the American Revolution, French Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution. Two of those you guys should know a little bit about. So hopefully this chapter resonates with you guys a little bit better than some of the things we've talked about in the past. So let's get started. Here are the instructional objectives, the things we're going to be covering. There's 4 of them there. They're kind of wordy, but I would pause and look over those just to make sure that we cover everything. So if it isn't something I cover, ask and I'll make sure that you get the information I may have missed. All right, so the first revolution we're going to talk about is the American Revolution. And we're going to talk about right before, like what led up to the American Revolution. And a lot of this was due to a rivalry. And this was among European powers. It intensified around the 1600s. Several things took place, like the Dutch attacked the Spanish, the Portuguese. They attacked the Spanish and Portuguese possessions in the Americas and Asia. And so you started seeing people just get a little bit more hostile. The British then, as they say, checked the Dutch commercial and colonial ambitions and things like that throughout the world. And then they went on to, Britain went on to defeat France in the 7 Years' War. The costs of these wars were really unprecedented. You see really for the first time just how, for these countries, just really how expensive war could get. And so Great Britain was essentially looking for ways to help pay for that war and pay things back. As we know, like taxation without representation, that type of thing. That's what you see happening here. So the price of the war and the different conflicts throughout the world, that Britain was trying to find a way to make some of that revenue back. Another cause or prelude to the war was the Enlightenment, which we have discussed in here a little bit already. Enlightenment thinkers trying to figure things out in the world, so applying the methods of the scientific revolution to study of human society, things like that, starting to question why society is structured the way that it's structured. Why isn't nobody really asking or challenging the old model of kings are in charge, that kind of thing. And you have some important people that we've talked about. So John Locke was the first one, argued that governments were created to protect people, emphasized the importance of individual rights. You have Rousseau, who thought the will of the people was sacred, believed that people would act collectively in the basis for all. So you kind of have some people starting to rethink things a little bit. Not all of the Enlightenment thinkers were considered radicals. You had many people like Voltaire who believed that monarchs could be agents of change if they were taught how to do that. And so these were some of the thinkers that helped kind of push those ideas forward. Kind of some other things with the Enlightenment. You had people, some members of the European nobility, for example, Catherine the Great, Frederick the Great. Catherine the Great was of Russia. Frederick the Great was from Prussia. They like to patronize the Enlightenment thinkers and use the Enlightenment ideas as they reformed their bureaucracies, legal systems, tax systems, things like that. They suppressed some of the more radical ideas, and they even attacked religion, which isn't good for keeping your masses happy. It says many of the major intellectuals of the Enlightenment communicated with each other and with political leaders. Women were instrumental in disseminating the ideas, purchasing and discussing writings of the Enlightenment thinkers. You saw women really help push the ideas out there. They were the ones who were having like book study groups talking about it. Why is this important? That kind of thing. And so the ideas began to spread, and they ended up spreading to the Americas. A lot of European intellectuals saw the Americas as this like uncorrupted place, this new place where social progress could happen quickly and things like that. Ben Franklin ended up symbolizing this. He had success in business. He was an intellectual. He was a scientist. He had a political career, and he was kind of this, like, he was one of the first, like, transatlantic celebrities just because of all the things that he was able to do. And so he became kind of a figure in this Enlightenment thought in the Americas. You did have some, just move down to folk cultures and popular protest. Many people in Western society did not share the ideas of the Enlightenment. Common people remained loyal to some of their cultural grounded values, that kind of thing. They weren't really willing to change, but that's just human race. Humans just aren't, as a mass, aren't naturally ready to change. And so with that, you also started seeing a lot of protests because of the taxes that we talked about earlier. You did have some spontaneous uprisings, things like that, but all of these things, kind of those colonial wars and conflicts, the fiscal crisis, the Enlightenment, and then the culture and popular protest helped start the American Revolution. And so here are some of the main ideas of the American Revolution. We're going to roll through these together. Many of these you've heard before, you've learned a lot, so we're not going to spend as much time on it. So let's talk about frontiers and taxes first. It says, after 1763, the British government faced two problems in North America, in the North American colonies. You have the danger of war with Amerindians, or Native Americans, as colonists pushed west, especially across the Appalachian, and they needed to raise taxes from the colonists to pay for a lot of the colonial administration and defense being key there. And so they attempted to impose taxes and prevent further westward settlement, but both of those things failed. In the Great Lakes region is specifically where we're going to talk about the Proclamation of 1763. What this did is it's led, there was some violence that took place with the Native Americans, and the proclamation was essentially what the British did to limit westward settlement. And so they were trying to slow down these regions north of Ohio, east of the Mississippi, and things like that, because they were trying to keep it keep people from expanding. Because if they expand westward, what that typically means is that they are going to have to protect them as they continue going west, and that's expensive. And the British were trying to find a way to cut costs. One of the most popular taxes that you hear about that got people riled up was the Stamp Act of 1765. Again, trying to raise revenue on the American colonies. If you don't know anything about stamps went on everything, not just like a letter, any sort of formal document, anything that you were doing, even playing cards had stamps on it, and they're trying to put a tax on that. What happened is that because of this, the colonists organized boycotts of British goods, staged a lot of violent protests, and even attacked British officials. And this, excuse me, guys. And this comes full blow with the Boston Massacre of 1770, and this is where you had these British soldiers standing outside of an armory. You had this crowd of protesters come up and start protesting them, and then they eventually start throwing snowballs. Now the story goes is that they started putting rocks in those snowballs and throwing them at the soldiers, which you hear it that way, you could invoke some like, oh, okay, this makes sense. And what happened is one of the soldiers, I think, fell and his gun went off or something like that, or thought they were being shot at, and so they opened fire on the actual protest. And the first, what's considered the first casualty of the American Revolution was a northern black man named Crispus Attucks, and he was the first one killed due to violence. And then the papers obviously took this and ran with it and tried to rally for the cause. This also, you see this happen because, or you see this lead to the British kind of trying to put a monopoly on tea, and then you have the Boston Tea Party because of it. Now, you have some important kind of moments, I guess, people and again, this is a survey world history course, so you don't get into all the details that you typically hear about the American Revolution, especially what you've studied in the American Revolution. And so some important people, some rallying support. Thomas Paine is the guy who's credited for really putting a voice to the revolution with writing of Common Sense. And this is where, like, if you've ever seen a booklet of Common Sense, it's very short, it's very quick, but it's important because it gets the ideas across easily and in common man's language. Thomas Paine becomes a huge celebrity out of this, helps push these ideas. Eventually goes to France and tries to do the same thing, but it ends up falling short. You also have the Declaration of Independence eventually was signed, which was a pretty big deal because what would happen if any of those members were caught, they would be killed for treason. And so the fact that they actually signed this and sent it to them was a big deal. I know it's something that often gets looked over, but like these guys could have, like if they were caught, they would have been killed for what they wrote. And so this ends up becoming a major turning point in the war. Now, the British sent a military force to really kind of pacify the colonies. They'd won most of its battles, but they were really unable to control the countryside. The British were also unable to achieve a compromise and political solution to the problems of the colonies. Because you kind of have these two things happening. You have the actual fighting, and then you have the political side, people trying to like find a treaty. And so the military side, like the British won most of the battles. And then on the political side, the colonies were just like, look, give us a voice, give us a say. We're British citizens. And they're like, no, you're colonists. You don't get to have that luxury. Now, you had the Native Americans served on both sides. For example, you had the Mohawk leader, Joseph Brant, led one of the most effective Native American forces in support of the British. And when the war was over, he and his followers ended up fleeing to Canada. France eventually, because of Benjamin Franklin and a couple other people, got into the war on the American side in 1778. Now, what this did is it gave us a navy, which we lacked, and then it gave us a ton of weapons and some foot soldiers, but really not as many as what people think. But what this did is we ended up getting a series of wins later in the war and pushed General Cornwallis to Yorktown, Virginia. And this is the famous Yorktown defeat, where you have the French Navy at the sea where they couldn't escape, and then you have the Americans surrounding by land. And so you have one of the first formal surrenders. Eventually, peace negotiators signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783, giving unconditional independence to the colonies. Now, you have the construction of the Republic institutions in 1800. So first we had the Articles of Confederation. We were really weary of having a strong central government, and so that's why the Articles were written. Problem was they were also ineffective, and this was shown by a couple of uprisings that took place in the colonies. And because we weren't able to effectively put them down, meaning we didn't have a national military force, people realized we need to rethink this. And so in May of 1787, a constitutional convention began to write a new constitution, establish the government that we have, but gave the vote only to the minority of the adult male population, and it protected slavery, which some people were against and some people were for. But America did change over time because of this. So you have some major institutions that were left in, some things were taken out, and so it's kind of that back and forth there. This is a map of some of the major battles that took place. As you look there towards the bottom, Cornwallis surrenders in October of 1781. Now, let's flip over to the French Revolution. This is one that I know if you took world history with me, that we went over in a lot of depth last year. And so we're going to get into this a little bit more today and hopefully get a little bit deeper than what we were able to last year. All right, so French society. Basically divided into three estates. You had the first estate, which was the clergy, the second estate, which was the nobility, and then the third estate was literally everybody else. The clergy and the nobility, they had a ton of wealth, and the clergy specifically, but even the nobility, were exempt from nearly all the classes. And so the third estate had the most people, like literally 95, 97% of the population was in the third estate, but they didn't have any money. And so you had these high taxes on the people that didn't have any money. And that was becoming a problem. Within the third estate, you have a fun word called a bourgeoisie, bourgeoisie. This was kind of the middle class of the third estate. And these were typically artisans, workers, shopkeepers, things like that. These were also the people who were willing to protest and speak out against what was going on in France during that time. You had a series of wars that the French put the French into debt even further, including helping us in the American Revolution. And so they tried to introduce new taxes, but the problem was you're trying to tax people who don't have money. It is simply not going to work. And so you have a ton of protests take place. Now, within France, you had this thing called the Estates General, which was kind of like a Congress only convened by the king. And it was, so you had the clergy in the first estate, you had the other nobility underneath the king in the second, and then you had a massive amount of people from the third estate being convened. The problem is when Louis the 16th, when he convened it, it hadn't been around for like 160 years. And so the problem was nobody really knew how to do this, what was happening. And every estate had one vote. Now that's a problem, because if 95 to 97% of your population is represented by the third estate, and they're always being outvoted, they're thinking, hey, easy way to fix this, tax the people that have money. And they're like, okay, let's vote on it. First estate, no. Second estate, no. Third estate, yes. 97% of the population was just outvoted by 3% of the population. And so it became an issue. And eventually, they get a little bit, the third estate gets a little bit too riled up, and they get locked out of the Estates General. And so they go to like this I don't know what you'd call it, like a tennis court type thing, and they create the National Assembly under the tennis court oath, and they say, we're going to meet until we have a new constitution. And eventually they come up with the Declaration of Rights of Man, which is almost like the Declaration of Independence. It's like their version of it. And so what they establish is that they want to have a constitutional monarchy. That's what happened first. And so the economic crisis grows worse. Then you have the people actually storm what was called the Palace of Versailles, which was outside of Paris, and grab the king and queen of the family, and they bring him back to Paris, and they say, hey, you're now part of us. And so they kind of like force them to be a part of what's going on, and they actually make a constitutional monarchy because of this. And then that's on the inside, and then on the outside, the queen, Marie Antoinette, is actually related to the royal family of Austria, and Austria and Prussia are both friends. And so you have this war happen, or this war declared in 1791. And so you have an internal crisis and an outward crisis, which is where you see the next part, which we're going to talk about, is kind of the terror, the violence part. Now, the Bastille right here is a pretty important moment, because the people of France look at the Bastille. If you see there, it's a prison, and they're like, we need to basically get rid of this. There's all these rumors swirling that there were tons of political prisoners in there. So like 800 people rush the Bastille, tear open the doors. They find like 6, 7, 8 guards, kill them all, put their heads on pike. Half of them leave to march those around Paris. The other half stay, and they find like maybe 3 prisoners in there. There was not very many. And then after that, the cool thing is that they actually hand by hand tear down this entire prison. And it was marked as like this is the beginning of the actual French Revolution. One of the parts within it is the terror. So in 1792, the king tries to flee France, and he makes it almost to the border, but then he is caught and he's brought back. And this is where people are like, okay, we can't trust the king anymore. And so you had this like faction that was more radical than the others, called the Jacobins. And the Jacobins were led by a guy named Robespierre. And Robespierre becomes kind of the voice or the leader of the French Revolution. And he's the guy who starts sending people to the guillotine, which is that thing that cuts people's heads off. And he is kind of the orchestrator of what becomes known as the Reign of Terror. Because they're fighting a war on the outside and they're trying to figure out things on the inside, Robespierre ends up consolidating power under what's called the Committee of Public Safety. And under the Committee of Public Safety, he is essentially in charge. And what happens is that any sort of like rumor or anything, he sends people to the guillotine just for that. And so you have the Reign of Terror actually take place from 1793 to 1794, and eventually people get tired of it because everybody, like 800 people a month are getting their head cut off. Like 800 people a month are getting sent to the guillotine, and people get tired of that, even though it lasts for a long time. And so you have Robespierre eventually gets arrested. He ends up trying to kill himself by shooting himself in the head. He botches it, and then he gets his head cut off. This leads to the rise of one of the most interesting figures, in my opinion, in all of history, which is Napoleon. People think he's short, but he really wasn't. That was mostly due to British propaganda in their newspapers. And so he ends up kind of taking over after Napoleon. You have this weird moment where they're like, hey, let's bring back the king's brother. And then that doesn't work. And so you kind of have this like weird moment. And then eventually Napoleon comes in and he sets up himself as the leader. And he starts out as a consul, and he rules with 2 other consuls. But eventually he says, now I'm the lead consul. And then eventually he calls himself emperor. But people liked him because he wasn't of royal blood. He was a common man. Like, he came from nothing and worked himself into where he was. And people liked that. And so they were more okay with Napoleon. Plus, he was a brilliant military leader. And so, again, they were more okay with him being solely in charge than anywhere else. And Napoleon is known for building up the military immensely. He expands the empire over time. For whatever freaking reason, he decides to go into Russia, which is weird.
It smells good down here.
I have no idea. I'm doing a video note thing right now, so you're going to be in it.
Can you see if that link?
It did.
It did? Okay.
Yeah, it did. Sorry, I meant to text you, but yeah.
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
All right.
Yep. For those of you who don't know, that was Mr. Young. All right. So from that, you have. So Napoleon ends up goes into Russia. He goes into Russia with like 650,000 soldiers. The Russians are like, we ain't doing this. They start retreating like crazy. But when they retreat, they burn, kill, take with them anything. So like they don't leave anything for them to pillage. And he goes into Russia with 650,000 soldiers. He comes back with like 30,000. So he's exiled, but not exiled very far. Then he makes a comeback. Then he tries to do the same things again, and he goes into a place called Waterloo, and then he gets beat badly there, and then he actually gets exiled off the southern coast of Africa, on an island called St. Helena. Check that out on Google Earth. It's kind of cool. All right, so that's a picture of the guillotine, which was used a lot. Let's look at, okay, so let's talk about the Haitian Revolution real quick. This is a new one for probably a lot of you guys. It's a little shorter, but it's also important. So the Haitian Revolution took place from 1789 to 1804. Haiti was actually a French colony, and it was one of the richest European colonies in the Americas. But its economic success was based on really one of the most brutal slave regimes of the Caribbean. So definitely not a positive thing if you were a slave. And so the political turmoil in France that the weakened the ability of the colonial administrators to maintain order, and that led to conflict between the slaves and the slave owners. Really, it was this brutal rebellion. And so the slave rebellion under the leadership of a guy named Francois Dominique, probably butchered that, Toussaint Louverture, again, probably butchered all that, and he took over the colony in 1794. Napoleon's 1802 attempt to reestablish authority led to the capture of Louverture, but failed to retake the colony. which became the independent Republic of Haiti in 1804. The Congress of Vienna, and then the conservative retrenchment. From 1814 to 1815, representatives of Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria met in Vienna to create a comprehensive peace settlement and reestablish safeguards of conservative order of Europe. The Congress of Vienna restored the monarchy, redrew the borders of France and other European states, and then established the Holy Alliance of Austria, Russia, and Prussia. The Holy Alliance defeated a lot of these liberal revolutions in Spain and Italy in 1820, and then tried without success to repress the liberal and nationalistic ideas. All these are taking place simultaneously. And then you have some nationalism, reform, and revolution. Popular support for national self-determination and democratic reform grew throughout Europe. Greece gained its independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1830, while France and the people of Paris forced the monarchy to accept constitutional rule and extend voting privileges. So you had some democratic reforms movements emerged in both Britain and the United States. In the United States, really the franchise was extended after the War of 1812. While in Britain, the response to the unpopular corn laws resulted in nearly 50% increase in the number of voters. In Europe overall, the desire for self-determination and democratic reform led to a series of revolutions in 1848. In France, the monarchy was overthrown and replaced by elected president Louis Napoleon. And then elsewhere in Europe, the revolutions of 1848 failed to gain their nationalistic and republican objectives. And so you had, really, because of these three main revolutions, a ton of these take place. People wanted freedom. People wanted the ability to determine their government for themselves. They didn't want just one person in charge because he happened to have the correct bloodline. That irritated people. The ideas of the Enlightenment were really starting to take hold and take shape here. This is a picture of Haiti's former slaves defend their freedom. Shows you Napoleon's Europe over time. And then this is kind of a cool graph because it actually shows you where the Haitian Revolution took place. Then it says there, if you look there, the first phase of up north, the first phase of the slave insurrection. Revolution of 1830 in Belgium. All right, guys, that is it. If you have questions over any of these three big ones or what happened because of it, please let me know. Otherwise, we will get to work this week on trying to dig a little deeper into these three.